Part 1 of St. Joan Preface. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. St. Joan Preface by George Bernard Shaw. Preface, Part 1. Joan the Original and Presumptuous. Joan of Arc, a village girl from the Vosges, was born about 1412. Burnt for heresy, witchcraft, and sorcery in 1431, rehabilitated after a fashion in 1456, designated venerable in 1904, declared blessed in 1908, and finally canonized in 1920. She is the most notable warrior saint in the Christian calendar, and the queerest fish among the eccentric worthies of the Middle Ages. Though a professed and most pious Catholic, and the projector of a crusade against the Hussites, she was in fact one of the first Protestant martyrs. She was also one of the first apostles of nationalism, and the first French practitioner of Napoleonic realism in warfare, as distinguished from the sporting, ransom-gambling chivalry of her time. She was the pioneer of rational dressing for women, and, like Queen Christina of Sweden 2 centuries later, to say nothing of Catalina de Arozzo and innumerable obscure heroines who have disguised themselves as men to serve as soldiers and sailors, she refused to accept the specific woman's lot, and dressed and fought and lived as men did. As she contrived to assert herself in all these ways with such force that she was famous throughout Western Europe before she was out of her teens, indeed, she never got out of them, it is hardly surprising that she was judicially burnt, ostensibly for a number of capital crimes which we no longer punish as such, but essentially for what we call unwomanly and insufferable presumption. At 18, Joan's pretensions were beyond those of the proudest pope or the haughtiest emperor. She claimed to be the ambassador and plenipotentiary of God, and to be, in effect, a member of the Church Triumphant, whilst still in the flesh on earth. She patronized her own king, and summoned the English king to repentance and obedience to her commands. She lectured, talked down, and overruled statesmen and prelates. She pooh-poohed the plans of generals, leading their troops to victory on plans of her own. She had an unbounded and quite unconcealed contempt for official opinion, judgment, and authority, and for War Office tactics and strategy. Had she been a sage and monarch in whom the most venerable hierarchy and the most illustrious dynasty converged, her pretensions and proceedings would have been as trying to the official mind as the pretensions of Caesar were to Cassius. As her actual condition was pure upstart, there were only two opinions about her. One was that she was miraculous, the other that she was unbearable. Joan and Socrates. If Joan had been malicious, selfish, cowardly, or stupid, she would have been one of the most odious persons known to history instead of one of the most attractive. If she had been old enough to know the effect she was producing on the men whom she humiliated by being right when they were wrong, and had learned to flatter and manage them, she might have lived as long as Queen Elizabeth. But she was too young and rustical and inexperienced to have any such arts. When she was thwarted by men whom she thought fools, she made no secret of her opinion of them, or her impatience with their folly. And she was naive enough to expect them to be obliged to her for setting them right and keeping them out of mischief. Now, it is always hard for superior wits to understand the fury roused by their exposures of the stupidities of comparative dullards. Even Socrates, for all his age and experience, did not defend himself at his trial like a man who understood the long accumulated fury that had burst on him and was clamoring for his death. His accuser, if born 2,300 years later, might have been picked out of any first-class carriage on a suburban railway during the evening or morning rush from or to the city, for he had really nothing to say except that he and his like could not endure being shown up as idiots every time Socrates opened his mouth. Socrates, unconscious of this, was paralyzed by his sense that somehow he was missing the point of the attack. He petered out after he had established the fact that he was an old soldier and a man of honorable life, and that his accuser was a silly snob. He had no suspicion of the extent to which his mental superiority had roused fear and hatred against him in the hearts of men towards whom he was conscious of nothing but goodwill and good service. Contrast with Napoleon. If Socrates was as innocent as this at the age of 70, it may be imagined how innocent Joan was at the age of 17. Now, Socrates was a man of argument, operating slowly and peacefully on men's minds, whereas Joan was a woman of action, operating with impetuous violence on their bodies. That, no doubt, is why the contemporaries of Socrates endured him so long, and why Joan was destroyed before she was fully grown. But both of them combined terrifying ability with a frankness, personal modesty, and benevolence which made the furious dislike to which they fell victims absolutely unreasonable, and therefore inapprehensible by themselves. Napoleon, also possessed of terrifying ability, but neither frank nor disinterested, had no illusions as to the nature of his popularity. When he was asked how the world would take his death, he said it would give a gasp of relief. But it is not so easy for mental giants, who neither hate nor intend to injure their fellows, to realize that nevertheless their fellows hate mental giants, and would like to destroy them, not only enviously, because the juxtaposition of a superior wounds their vanity, but quite humbly and honestly, because it frightens them. Fear will drive men to any extreme, and the fear inspired by a superior being is a mystery which cannot be reasoned away. Being immeasurable, it is unbearable when there is no presumption or guarantee of its benevolence and moral responsibility. In other words, when it has no official status. The legal and conventional superiority of Herod and Pilate, and of Annas and Caiaphas, inspires fear. But the fear, being a reasonable fear of measurable and avoidable consequences, which seems salutary and protective, is bearable, whilst the strange superiority of Christ and the fear it inspires elicit a shriek of "Crucify him!" from all who cannot divine its benevolence. Socrates has to drink the hemlock, Christ to hang on the cross, and Joan to burn at the stake, whilst Napoleon, though he ends in St. Helena, at least dies in his bed there, and many terrifying but quite comprehensible official scoundrels die natural deaths in all the glory of the kingdoms of the world, proving that it is far more dangerous to be a saint than to be a conqueror. Those who have been both, like Mahomet and Joan, have found that it is the conqueror who must save the saint, and that defeat and capture mean martyrdom. Joan was burnt without a hand lifted on her own side to save her. The comrades she had led to victory, and the enemies she had disgraced and defeated, the French king she had crowned, and the English king whose crown she had kicked into the Loire, were equally glad to be rid of her. Was Joan innocent or guilty? As this result could have been produced by a crapulous inferiority as well as by a sublime superiority, the question which of the two was operative in Joan's case has to be faced. It was decided against her by her contemporaries after a very careful and conscientious trial, and the reversal of the verdict 25 years later in form a rehabilitation of Joan was really only a confirmation of the validity of the coronation of Charles VII. It is the more impressive reversal by a unanimous posterity, culminating in her canonization, that has quashed the original proceedings and put her judges on their trial, which so far has been much more unfair than their trial of her. Nevertheless, the rehabilitation of 1456, corrupt job as it was, really did produce evidence enough to satisfy all reasonable critics that Joan was not a common termagant, not a harlot, not a witch, not a blasphemer. no more an idolater than the Pope himself, and not ill-conducted in any sense apart from her soldiering, her wearing of men's clothes, and her audacity, but on the contrary good-humoured, an intact virgin, very pious, very temperate. We should call her meal of bread soaked in the common wine, which is the drinking water of France, ascetic. Very kindly, and though a brave and hardy soldier, unable to endure loose language or licentious conduct. She went to the stake without a stain on her character, except the overweening presumption, the superbity, as they called it, that led her thither. It would, therefore, be waste of time now to prove that the Joan of the first part of the Elizabethan Chronicle play of Henry VI, supposed to have been tinkered by Shakespeare, grossly libels her in its concluding scenes in deference to jingo patriotism. The mud that was thrown at her has dropped off by this time so completely that there is no need for any modern writer to wash up after it. What is far more difficult to get rid of is the mud that is being thrown at her judges, and the whitewash which disfigures her beyond recognition. When jingo scurrility had done its worst to her, sectarian scurrility, in this case Protestant scurrility, used her stake to beat the Roman Catholic Church and the Inquisition. The easiest way to make these institutions the villains of a melodrama was to make the maid its heroine. That melodrama may be dismissed as rubbish. Joan had a far fairer trial from the Church and the Inquisition than any prisoner of her type, and in her situation, gets nowadays in any official secular court, and the decision was strictly according to law. And she was not a melodramatic heroine, that is, a physically beautiful lovelorn parasite on an equally beautiful hero, but a genius and a saint, about as completely the opposite of a melodramatic heroine as it is possible for a human being to be. Let us be clear about the meaning of the terms. A genius is a person who, seeing farther and probing deeper than other people, has a different set of ethical valuations from theirs, and has energy enough to give effect to this extra vision and its evaluations in whatever manner best suits his or her specific talents. A saint is one who, having practiced heroic virtues and enjoyed revelations or powers of the order which the Church classes technically as supernatural, is eligible for canonization. If a historian is an anti-feminist and does not believe women to be capable of genius in the traditional masculine departments, he will never make anything of Joan, whose genius was turned to practical account mainly in soldiering and politics. If he is rationalist enough to deny that saints exist, and to hold that new ideas cannot come otherwise than by conscious ratiocination, he will never catch Joan's likeness. Her ideal biographer must be free from 19th-century prejudices and biases, must understand the Middle Ages, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Holy Roman Empire much more intimately than our Whig historians have ever understood them, and must be capable of throwing off sex partialities and their romance, and regarding woman as the female of the human species, and not as a different kind of animal with specific charms and specific imbecilities. Joan's good looks. To put the last point roughly, any book about Joan which begins by describing her as a beauty may be at once classed as a romance. Not one of Joan's comrades in village, court, or camp, even when they were straining themselves to please the king by praising her, ever claimed that she was pretty. All the men who alluded to the matter declared most emphatically that she was unattractive sexually to a degree that seemed to them miraculous, considering that she was in the bloom of youth, and neither ugly, awkward, deformed, nor unpleasant in her person. The evident truth is that, like most women of her hardy, managing type, she seemed neutral in the conflict of sex because men were too much afraid of her to fall in love with her. She herself was not sexless, in spite of the virginity she had vowed up to a point and preserved to her death. She never excluded the possibility of marriage for herself. But marriage, with its preliminary of the attraction, pursuit, and capture of a husband, was not her business. She had something else to do. Byron's formula, "Man's love is of